Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture with Mr. Hershey Dwoskin. I just have to make up some announcements before I let Mr. Dwoskin talk. So next week, next Tuesday, Mr. Dwoskin will not be here because of Rosh Hashanah. He will return the week after on the 30th. We have a few programs coming up next week. So we also have Meet the Artist with Carol Rabinovich. She's the one that is up in the art gallery in the library. You could come and chat with her. It will be held there at 5 o'clock on Thursday. Then on Monday, we have CSL Reads with Emma Donahue will be here. It's at 7 o'clock. We'll have some live music and there'll be late refreshments. The 29th, yes, that's correct. That is at 7 o'clock. It will be here. You don't need to register, just show up. And on the 30th, we'll have Mr. Dwoskin coming back on the Tuesday at 2 o'clock here in the auditorium. And on the 3rd of October, we'll have Friday afternoon at the movies. It will be The Materialists. It's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Also, I'd like to mention we have a program to learn French. Well, not to learn, to speak French. If you are interested, the registration starts on Thursday at 11 a.m. The teacher will vet you before you are actually allowed to attend the class. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Hershey Dwoskin. I teach classes in current events, things to do with history, things to do with politics, geography, economics, science, all kinds of different subjects get mixed in here. And it's just such great pleasure to come and see you all again. Because you know, we have so many choices in life of what we can do. And this is a choice that I've made to teach people interested in what's going on. And I've been doing this for probably, I would say, since the 70s. So that would make it pretty well close to 50 odd years. Of course, what was current to 50 years ago is history now. So there's always something new happening in the world. And the importance of knowing what's going on and the importance of studying history gives you context into what's going on. And the shame of it is that nowadays you see people running around with signs. As we all know, this, you know, we see signs all over the place, Free Palestine and all kinds of things like that. I mean, some of these people couldn't find Palestine on a map if they tried. My brother, who teaches in Ottawa, he says he saw one sign, Free Palestine. So, you know, if they don't even know what Palestine is, why are they holding a sign up? Now, obviously, when people study history, history is not something in some way that's like science. It's not something like mathematics. It's not something where the exact same properties will come out in an experiment the exact same way if you keep doing it all the time. So history itself is a social science. It's something written by people who all come from different backgrounds and have their different opinions and have their different outlooks. So it isn't something that you could point to and say, well, we know what happened at a certain point, and sometimes things are let's say, unquestioned. I was reading a story today about the excavation of Pompeii, which was destroyed by an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. So if you said somebody, if you asked people in the whole world, well, when did Mount Vesuvius erupt and destroy Pompeii? Everyone should say the same answer. It was 79 AD. If somebody says, no, I think it was in 89 AD, people can think anything, but they're wrong. They are wrong. But if you say something like, well, what caused World War II or World War I? Well, then you've got a whole bunch of different opinions. And the so-called real answer isn't one that's so easy to find, because depending on who you are, what country you represent, when you lived, you can have a different kind of interpretation about something like that. So that's why it's important to learn about what's going on around the world, so it gives you an idea of context and looks at different points of view to get to understand not only in depth what's going on, but also to understand how other people who disagree with you might come to those conclusions that are different from yours. So it's a mixture. You could say that history is a mixture in a certain way of fact and opinion. And some of you, well, all of you, let's say, when you were, might have been in school, you might have seen on some bookshelf a big fat book about this fact from here to the bottom called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And this book was one which was researched by a man named Mr. Gibbons. And he had his opinion. His opinion is this thick on what caused the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But another historian, looking at the same facts, might have come to a different conclusion. So this is where I'm saying that it's important to understand it's important to understand the context around everything. Because if you are just somebody who has a very narrow way of looking at things, somebody who has a slogan and says, I keep repeating the slogan, well, then you're not really appreciating how things interact with each other, how events interact with each other, how people influence each other, how things can be black one day and white another day. So that's why it's important to get a better understanding of what's going on in the world. That's kind of an introduction. It gives you a flavor of what I try to present here. So let me start off by saying that for a person who's an optimist, these are tough times. These are very tough times. If you watch the news, if you read news magazines, if you read newspapers, as some people still do, I would say you're looking at maybe 90% of bad news and 10% of good news, if you exclude sports and fashion and stuff like that. So it is really a difficult time to be an optimist. Now, you have to always remember that in news coverage, good news never plays well. It's always bad news that plays well. Something happens, a tornado, a hurricane, a war, a bankruptcy. It's rare to find, somebody writing in the newspaper something like a new house is built on your street. Like, who cares, Or that, children in school are now doing better than they used to. That doesn't make headlines. What makes headlines is children in school are doing worse than they used to. That already makes headlines, which, by the way, was a headline in this week's news, that the United States children's score in reading has hit the lowest in 20 years. So, that's a piece of news that is something that is not good. So you get the idea. There's an inbred bias, an bred bias toward bad news, toward violence, towards spectacular things. And everyday news, like an African country, which slowly is making its way in the world. The continent of Africa is the poorest continent by far, and yet some parts of it are really making good progress and improving the standards of living of their inhabitants by large numbers. That's not going to be in the news. No one cares. So that's why I'm saying that for people who are interested, like I am, you can't allow the sort of torrent of disturbing news to take you over, because there's always good things that are happening. It's just that people don't write about them. So that's what I'm saying. But to go back to what I'm saying now, let's just do a small review of what's been bothering us. And I have to say, probably number one on this list is that the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, he's only been in office for 8 months. Think of it, 8 months over 4 years. So he hasn't even served a quarter of his term. And yet look at how much has changed in the country since he was elected. The fact is that he was already president once for 4 years. And if people look back at what he did then and what he said then and compare it to what he's done now and says now, it's almost like there's two. I mean, it's the same person. It's just that this person has become so much more aggressive and so much more radical than what he was before. And part of the reason for that is that before he had cabinet ministers and he had people in his government who would stop him if he said something wrong or did something wrong, and he would listen to them because he said, okay, I'm new at this job. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never, ever in my life run any kind of public office. I've never been a mayor. I've never been a governor. I've never been a senator. I've never been in the House of Representatives. I mean, you have to go back very, very far in history to find such an unqualified person to be a president, if by qualification means that you've done something like you're doing beforehand. You would have to go very far back. And I'm not even sure you could find someone even if you went that far back. So that's why he may have respected the views of people who were professionals in the military or professional economists or professionals in labor or education or professional scientists. But now he seems to say that I know everything, and if you disagree with me, I'm going to fire you. So if that's the case, then no one's going to disagree with him. So if no one disagrees with him, then he says, well, okay, I can do whatever I want. And that's what seems to be going on. So I made just a tiny list, and I mean tiny list of things which the consequence of which are that the United States is the most divided it's ever been since before the Civil War. No one around here has been living in the times of the Civil War. But if you want to get an idea of what the atmosphere was like in the United States before the Civil War, meaning in the 1850s, late 1840s, we'll call it the 1850s. The atmosphere then, in some ways, is similar to what the atmosphere is now. The only difference is that now it's much worse, because in the pre-Civil War times, the divisions in the United States were, for the most part, people who lived in the North versus people who lived in the South. So yes, there were people who lived in the South who were anti-slavery and who wanted to preserve the Union. And there were people who lived in the North who said, you know what, we don't want to divide the country and let the Southerners keep their slaves, and let's just all get along and let's just get rich together. So there were, in other words, on either side, there were people in the minority who disagreed with what the majority thought. But it wasn't a lot of people. It was not a lot at all. Today in the United States, the divisions are not geographic. The divisions are everywhere. That means that there are supporters of President Trump and opponents of President Trump everywhere. Let's start off with a little question. In the last election in the US, which state in the United States voted by the greatest proportion for President Trump? Give me a guess. Florida, no. Texas, no. California, of course not. They voted for the Democrats. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. It's the state that has the smallest population in the country, in the United States. It's Wyoming. Wyoming voted 70% for Trump. Now, 70% for Trump still means that 30% of the people didn't vote for him. So looking at our group here that we're sitting here, there's about 50 people here. Yeah, more. Let's call it 60 people. So of 60 people, that means about 20 people out of the 60 would have voted for the Democrats in the most Republican state in the United States. The second most was West Virginia, by the way. So anybody who said that was just about right. What that means, and vice versa, right? Vice versa. So the states that were very strongly for the Democrats still had a large proportion of people who voted for the Republicans. So what that means is within every state, you've got people who profoundly disagree with each other because President Trump has divided the country on purpose so drastically. And, you know, there's a saying that says that the house divided against itself cannot stand, which was the slogan before the Civil War. It means that for political purposes, he has drawn a line not only around the United States against the rest of the world, but he's drawn a line within the United States between his supporters and everybody else. And people who are not his supporters, he calls traitors, and he uses every method to try to undermine them. And so this action which is reinforced by the use of power and the use of manipulation and the use of reward and punishment, has meant that in a normal democracy, the opposition, if they're out of office, doesn't have a lot to say. In other words, like in any democracy, you have a party in power and a party out of power. The party that's in power doesn't owe anything to the party out of power. If they do something that's not popular, they might see it in an opinion poll, but they may say, well, who cares about polls? We're not running for election. The party out of power might yell and scream in the parliament or on the street corner saying you're doing something wrong and you're failing the country. But the party in power says, yeah, well, when it's your turn to run the country and you get elected, you can do what you want. Meantime, it's our job and we're doing whatever we want. So the opposition parties in general, unless it's a coalition government, don't have a lot to, they have a lot to say, but they don't have a lot of power to influence the party that's in power. Who has the influence of the party in power is the people themselves who were elected for that party. So that, for example, like let's just talk about our situation here in Canada. When Justin Trudeau got to be unpopular, who was it that got him out? It wasn't the Conservative Party who got him out. It was Liberals who said, hey, if you don't leave now, we're going to end up, losing our shirts. And we are just not going to support you anymore. And so he got the message, I would say a little bit late, but he got the message and he left. Now, who in the Republican Party is telling Mr. Trump that the things that he's doing are not good for the country? Nobody. Because the answer is he would say to them, if you don't like it, leave. And if you don't leave and you keep complaining, when the next time comes around, I'm going to nominate somebody for your job, and I'm going to make sure you lose the nomination to run for the Republican Party. And that happened most clearly with Elizabeth Cheney, who was one of Trump's strongest opponents. And she was the congresswoman from Wyoming. And she opposed him, and she voted to impeach him. And he said, fine, when an election comes up, I'm nominating for the Republican nomination someone else. I'm telling all my supporters to vote for them, and you're going to lose. And she did. And she did. So Trump is not afraid to use all the power in the world to eliminate his opponents within the Republican Party, never mind outside the Republican Party. So let's just now go through a very quick review in 8 months of the things that he's done. So we'll start with the tariffs, since that's something which is of interest to many people. Trump had this notion that if the United States has a trade deficit in goods with another country, that means the United States is losing. No economist in his right mind would ever agree with that. But there's no one to tell Trump anything because he has his own mind made up. So what tariffs are is a tax, as you know, on goods coming into the country. So any good that comes into the country has to pay a tax. And that tax is what it's supposed to do is to raise prices for the consumer so that the next time around they won't buy an imported good, but they'll buy a good made in the United States. And all that extra demand for goods made in the US will lead to jobs making those goods. So it's a certain sense, it's a way of protecting the existing businesses in the United States. It's a way of discouraging people from buying foreign goods. And at the same time, it's a way to raise money for the government because all those tariffs go into the Treasury. Now, the last time that the United States tried this high tariff regime was when the Depression had just broken out in the 1930s, 1929, 1930. People were losing their jobs like crazy. And the solution that the Republicans thought of at that time was to stop foreign goods from coming into the country so that at a time when people were losing their jobs, there would be more demand for locally made goods, and people would then, of course, start to work again in factories making those goods. The fact is, of course, that it did exactly the opposite, because what happened was foreign goods, the tariffs that were put on foreign goods, of course, raised prices in the US. People still didn't have jobs, so they couldn't afford to buy anything, never mind the goods that were imported. So prices went up, but people's wages didn't go up and the employment didn't go up. But it spread the depression around the world, because if nobody around the world could make goods to sell in the US, they would lose their jobs. That means they couldn't buy goods made in the US, they're exported to abroad, and the whole world entered into a depression. Now, that depression was not only caused by the tariffs, something called the Smoot-Hawley Act, but it was exacerbated by those tariffs that were put on. And the lesson was, when people emerge from the depression, we'll never use tariffs again as a measure to try to defend the economy. So that was the message. You know, it stuck in people's minds from around 1940 up until 2024, when Trump revived this idea. We also know from looking at countries' economies in the long run, that countries that try to use tariffs as a way of protecting their own industries, inevitably, these countries fall behind. And South America is a great example. So Brazil, for example, Argentina, for example, they put tariffs again during the 1930s to try to protect their industries. And what happened was that because there was no foreign competition coming in to those countries, companies that had a kind of a, we'll call it a kind of a monopoly, or they had a large share of the market, they could produce no crappy goods and raise their prices because the tariffs would not allow competition to come in from abroad. Now, if we just sort of skip ahead a little bit to America, something we remember was around the 1980s when American car companies were making really bad cars, like the Pinto and the Nova. Some of you might remember the Corvair, the cars that basically were just rust buckets. And because at that time, Japanese cars were just starting to enter into the market, America could get away with making those bad cars. But so quickly, the Japanese perfected a manufacturing system. They perfected making better cars for less money. And there always was a small tariff on foreign-made cars, but the tariff was small, like 2.5%, that they were able to more or less almost bankrupt the American car companies until, well, some of them actually did go bankrupt, until they could get their act together and start making cars that people wanted. So the message is that tariffs in the end don't work. And we know that from history. But Trump is using tariffs also as a means of political pressure. And this is what he loves to do. So for example, in Brazil, there was an election. The person who backed Mr. Trump, Mr. Bolsonaro, lost the election. Mr. Bolsonaro tried to stay in office when he shouldn't have. He and his family have been accused of all kinds of bribe taking, which is not unusual. And then there was a court case that was put up against Mr. Bolsonaro where he was found guilty of trying to stay in office illegally. And since Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's son are Trump's friends, Trump said, oh, you know what? I'm going to put a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods coming into the United States. So it has nothing to do with economics, nothing to do with a balance of trade. Now, who sells more to whom? Does Brazil sell more to the US or does the US sell more to Brazil? The US sells more to Brazil. So if the US sells more to Brazil, you would think it should be Brazil putting tariffs on American goods, according to Trump's logic. But in fact, he put tariffs on Brazilian goods not because of a trade deficit, but simply because he doesn't like Brazil's leadership. The whole idea, he thinks, of one country selling more to another country, and therefore is taking advantage of that, is ridiculous. Because a trade deficit simply means that in goods, you buy more from somebody else than they buy from you. And in essence, that's neither good nor bad on the first look of it. One reason why the United States buys so many more goods from other countries than they buy from the US is that the US is a rich country. So people can afford to buy Danish furniture. They can afford to buy Swiss watches. They can afford to buy Porsches and Ferraris. If you were a very poor country in Africa, you wouldn't have a trade surplus with somebody else, a trade deficit with someone else, because you can't afford to buy anything. See, so the idea that the US is somehow or other disadvantaged by having a trade deficit is wrong, because it's not like the money that goes out of the country disappears. What happens is the money that goes out of the country buys goods that come into the US that people use up. Not only that, but what does a country do when it has all those US dollars that they got for selling products in the US? There's a whole bunch of US dollars that sits around in different banks all around the world. And what they do with those US dollars is they go ahead back to the US and buy US bonds, US paper. They lend money to the US, in other words, to help the US economy. So that's what happens to that money. A lot of it goes right back into the US. So this whole notion of tariffs is something that's so outdated and so wrong. And it's wrong for so many different reasons. Because if his job, first of all, it only measures goods. That's one thing. But today, most people, the most money that changes hands is not for goods at all, right? If you think of the internet, and you think of something like Netflix, and you think of something like all the computer services that are bought and sold, and all the management services, and the financial services, that's where all the money is these days. It's not selling stuff in boxes that gets shipped from one country to another. And think of Canada. I mean, we supposedly have a trade surplus with the US, but on the other hand, we import so many non-trade goods from the US. Right? Every subscription to Netflix, every use of a computer, every Apple subscription, all of that are not considered imports or exports, but that's where all the money's going. So the US is making far more off of us than we are them, even though in goods we sell them more than we buy from them. And even that is subject to dispute. So he's taking such a small part of the economy and he's turning the whole world upside down because of it. Some of the examples are just ludicrous. And I'll give you one. He's picked on countries that have absolutely nothing. And one of the best examples is the country called Lesotho. Anybody know where that is? You've heard of it anywhere? You're right, it's in South Africa. It's surrounded by South Africa. It's a country that has basically nothing. Now, because they have a large population of young people, some entrepreneurs said, you know what we're going to do? And because so many of the people in Lesotho go to try to work in South Africa, both legally and illegally, and South Africa doesn't like it. So South Africa encouraged, among other things, the opening up of jeans factories in Lesotho, making jeans, all done by women who normally would have nothing else to do but milk the cows. And these jeans are made for different companies and they're sold mostly in the US. Okay. So if you look at the balance of trade between Lesotho and the US, what you will find is Lesotho buys nothing from the US, but they sell jeans to the US. So therefore, Lesotho has a huge trade surplus with the US, which Trump looks at and says, this is terrible. But the people can't afford to buy anything. What are they going to buy from the US? Think of what does the US sell that these people need? Pretty well nothing, because they can't afford anything. So he put on a huge tariff of, I think it was 50% on jeans coming from Lesotho, which caused the factories to close, which caused the women to go back to milking cows. And how did that benefit the US? Not a bit, not one bit, because they didn't collect any money from jeans made in Lesotho because the factory's closed, so they don't make any jeans anymore. So just this whole notion of tariffs is one which has upset the whole world because no country wants to get the feeling that you're getting a bill for doing trade, fair trade. And the way he did it was so sort of fly by night and slapdash that he, said one thing one day, another thing another day, and nobody could plan anything. So let's just talk a little bit about this. So if tariffs are supposed to increase the prices, right? Because let's say from Canada, he said anything that comes into the US is now subject to a 35% tariff unless it's in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. But things like aluminum, copper, cars, and other stuff is all being charged, okay? So that money then is paid by the importer to the US Treasury. So if the money is paid by the importer to the US Treasury, how does the importer get that money back? So either the importer has to raise prices to cover every penny that they've made, or they have to go to the exporter and say, listen, if you don't do anything, my prices are going to go up by 35%. So what I'd like you to do is cut your prices to me by 10%, and I'll cut my profit by 10%, and I'll increase the price of the goods to the customer by 15%, and that's how you get the 35%. Logical? That's what's happening. That's what's happening. So what it means in actual fact is that companies are going to have less profits because they have to eat up some of those tariffs. If they have less profits, that means they pay less corporate taxes. Not today, but a year from now. So it's a tax on, and then the rest of it comes in increased prices to the consumer. So everybody loses out, except the US Treasury, which gets money. Okay. So here's the question. The tariffs have been in effect for about 6 months. US price increases have been fairly moderate. How come? People were saying, oh my God, this is going to be the end of the world. Yes. Yeah, people knew the tariffs were coming, so they stocked up. They stocked up really hard, and they imported everything they possibly could import before the tariffs went into effect. So when all that inventory gets used up, that's when prices will start to see going up. And the other explanations are, as I said, that in some ways, the importers are eating some of that tariff, and the exporters are eating some of that tariff also. One of the big disputes between Canada and the US is about lumber. The United States imports a quarter of all of its lumber from Canada. The US put tariffs on all that lumber. So you would think that the price of lumber in the US would go up. In actual fact, the price of lumber in the US went down. It's lower now than before the tariffs went on. How come? Because partly of what this lady just said, the importers knew. They actually built warehouses in the US from scratch to take all the lumber from Canada before the tariffs went on. They figured that they've got about a 6-month supply of lumber now in the US that's just sitting there waiting to get used up. Because of all of Trump's actions, the economy in the US has slowed down considerably. So when it slows down, of course, there's less demand for housing and less demand for lumber. So that's the reason why so far the prices of lumber haven't gone up. Yes, I see your hand over there. Oh, every 6 months. Yeah. 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 Well, I know that he called up the head of Walmart, the biggest retailer in the U.S., and he said, Walmart, like lots of other companies, import most of their goods from the Far East: shoes, clothing, furniture, toys, a whole wide range of goods, dishware. You could think of just about everything that Walmart sells. There's not a hell of a lot of it that's made in the U.S. And the president of Walmart, when the tariffs went on, said, we're going to have to increase our prices. And Trump called him up and says, no, you don't. You just have to make less profit. Now, so you eat the tariffs. That's what he said. Now, imagine if somebody called him up to say, Mar-a-Lago, this hotel that you're running, I think you should make less profits. Like, why don't you not pass on any increase in costs that you have for labor, for materials, for anything else? So business doesn't work that way. And if it did, in the long run, it would be worse because companies would end up closing, people would be out of work. And these people are not just workers, but they're consumers. So it would be like a vicious circle or a chain reaction type of thing. Um, so the last couple of reports showed how much the U.S. economy has slowed down. In fact, the U.S. economy, for the first time since COVID, had a negative growth rate. In other words, the economy shrank for the first time since 2020. And, what happens when Trump gets figures like that is he just fires the head of the agency who produces the figures. And so, if people are afraid to report the truth, well, then the truth becomes whatever he says it is. And this is such a danger because, like I was saying at the very beginning, people have two different versions of what the truth is: what I think it is and what you think it is. The idea of reporting financial results every 6 months is not that radical. In Europe, they do it. Some people say that if a company has to report the results every quarter, in other words, every 3 months, what it means is that their thinking becomes very short term, that they just look 3 months ahead to make their figures look good. And instead of saying, well, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make an investment today that it will pay off in 2 or 5 years. If you do that, the money comes out of your bank account, and then the next quarter, everybody sees, oh, you don't have so much money. That's not good. And your stock falls. So, and plus, of course, it's an enormous accounting expense to report 4 times a year instead of 2 times a year. So the people who like this 4 times a year are accountants because they have to be doing all that work. It's not the end of the world to make reporting every 6 months, but it's being able to rely on the figures that are produced that's important. So we just spoke a touch about tariffs. Well, let's look on to some other things. Migration. His next great subject. He promised that he would stop illegal migration into the United States, and he did. He did. So it means that the tens of thousands of people who are illegally crossing the border are now pretty well stopped. He also said that he would kick out any migrants from the country who are criminals, etc. And we all know, of course, that there are not that many migrant criminals around. And the ones that are around are not easy to catch. But it's very easy to catch plain old migrants. And that he's done, with gusto. So, there are raids all over the places where people are just being picked up, put in jail, and shipped off to who knows where. without much legal authority behind it. In fact, he's even disobeyed judges' orders not to deport people. And, you know, on local families and local communities, this has a horrible effect. So I was reading a story, and you might have read about it, about a meat packing plant in Nebraska, where he walked in, the ICE agents walked in, that's immigration control, ICE, immigration control, something or other. What's it stand for? I forget what the E stands for. Enforcement, yeah. And you know, they took the entire production line offline and arrested them all. And the guy who runs the plant, he says, look, you know, these people have worked for me for 15 and 20 years. They're all good workers. They show up. I can't get anybody else. So what he said is this: I am opening up my job at $20 an hour to anybody who wants to stand up for 10 hours a day in a freezer, in a freezing environment with very sharp knives, cutting apart animals with blood all over the place and blood on your shoes. And, you know, anybody who wants a job can come and get it. So, because remember, they arrested 100 people. So the next day, 6 people showed up. Every one of them was an illegal immigrant. So, in other words, what is this guy supposed to do? I was reading a story about a Wisconsin dairy farmer. He says cows have to be milked at 4 in the morning. And then they also have to be milked like 12 hours later. But, you know, usually by the same people, kind of. Like, who's going to come and shovel out cow manure at 4 in the morning, get up in the cold, and you know, put milking apparatus on cows, you know, and do this work? He says there isn't anybody. So what am I supposed to do? There was this all comes from the New York Times, by the way. New York Times did a feature on cherry farmers in Washington State. The guy showed up pictures of his cherries. He couldn't find anybody to pick them because all of his workers were afraid to get arrested. So this sort of action has tremendous downstream effects. It's not like, oh, I'm just getting rid of the criminals out of the country. And by the way, if you think of how, if you just give a little thought to it, let's pretend he just picked up all the criminals and got them out. You know what that means? It's a vacuum of criminality. That means other criminals will become criminals in order to fill up the spaces that these people just left. Somebody has to sell the drugs. Somebody has to import the drugs. Somebody has to shake down who knows who for who knows what. So, you know, if you take away the competition, new groups of people will come in to take their jobs. They might be American gangsters. You're right. It'll be like in the 1930s. Yeah, it could be. There is a legal way to get a permit for a permit. Okay. Right. Your point is very well taken. And let's come back to us here in Canada. We are in a fortunate position that we only have one neighbor, the US. So not that many people. Now they're starting to come from the US into Canada. But up until now, I mean, we didn't have to worry about a flood of immigrants from anywhere coming here, because how would they get here? You know, they're not going to walk here. They'd have to take a plane here. That means they'd have to have money to get here, and they could be refused at the airport. Nobody comes by ship anymore. So like we're kind of like an insulated place from that movement. Europe is dealing with this all the time. Now I'll just mention, you know, I came from Italy. I told some people I just arrived from Italy 3 days ago, and the biggest issue in that country is migration and what to do about the migrants. So the point that this lady said is correct. In other words, that you can't have open borders and allow anybody to come into your country in an unrestricted way. The part about draining the economy is a bit less accurate because these people, they don't want to sit and do nothing. They want to be the ones who milk the cows at 4 in the morning and who work in the meat packing plants. Most of the people who come in are of working age. They're not like senior citizens trying to get a pension because they can't get a pension anyway. So they're not that much of a drain on the economy in any real way. Remember that they are also consumers. So when they make money working, they also spend it to buy groceries and gasoline and cars and everything else. So the part about being a drain on the economy is not quite accurate. In the short term, it does happen because if states or cities have programs to house them and help them get started, this is a drain to get started. But by and large, most, but not all, immigrants are there to make their lives better and their family lives better. And they don't do it just to sit around and collect some sort of welfare that they're not entitled to get anyway. But still, you do have to have control over who comes into your country, because if not, theoretically, I mean, the country could be overwhelmed and not be able to absorb all the people that come in all at the same time. Let's mention the fact that the U.S., like all countries in the Western world, has a birth rate that's far below replacement level. In fact, I just read this week, this is news of the week, the U.S. has just come out of the lowest year for births ever by number of children per woman. So you need to have 2.1 children per woman to make your population stable, assuming nobody comes in and nobody goes out. Makes sense, right? Because some children die before they get to be parents themselves. The US's birth rate is somewhere in the 1.3 area. Not by any means the lowest in the world, because the lowest in the world is in East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, where it's under 1 per woman. So, and Japan also. So if you don't replenish your population with immigrants, and people we all know are getting older, just look at all of us, we're leading the way here. So who's going to do all the work? The problem with what this lady said was, the problem with what this lady said is people should come in the normal way. But the US has made it very hard to come in the normal way. Trump's philosophy is no immigrant is a good immigrant. Now, that's not his personal philosophy, but it's the philosophy of a lot of people in his government. So they don't want any immigrants because they feel that any immigrants who come in are going to take jobs away from Americans, number one. Number two, any immigrant who comes in doesn't look like me, doesn't speak like me, doesn't believe like me, and we don't want these people in our country, period. So if that's the attitude, then it's not easy. Businesses are demanding visas for high-skilled people, for researchers, I mean, if you look at who is it who owns some of the biggest companies in the US, they're all immigrants or children of immigrants, right? Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, I mean, all of them. The biggest companies are run by immigrants or children of immigrants because that's what nature does. These people come with talents, they come with perspective, they come with contacts, and they come with a desire to make it in a new country. I think to our great credit in Canada, to our great credit, we have a country almost second to none, which sees that immigrants are more positive than negative. and that this applies pretty well to all the political parties. Even the Conservative Party believes that as well. Our difficulty is simply that in the last government, they allowed in 1 million people in 1 year. Okay, now 1 million people in 1 year, people said there just isn't enough housing for them. It's not easy for all these people to find jobs. It's not easy for them to get started. It's an additional burden on the hospital system, on the school system, all this, right? So what's 1 million out of 40 million in percent? Where's the mathematical geniuses in here? 2.5. Come on, give me a break. 2.5%, okay? My grandfather came here from the Russia, Ukraine in 1913. In 1913, Canada had 8 million people, and they admitted in 1913 500,000 people. That's 500,000 out of 8 million. That's like 7% they took in 1 year, not 2.5%. For a long time, Canada had a goal of saying we want 1% of our population as immigration people, as immigrants, and they never even reached that 1%. Because, why? The immigration authorities are so backed up on applications. I think they have something like 900,000 applications that they're still backed up on that they haven't approved. And it's not out of malice. In the US, it's out of malice. They just say, Trump gives the thing, we don't want immigrants, period. You know, don't let anybody in. So it's not like somebody says, well, you know what, I'm going to take a shortcut by crossing the border instead of going to a US consul or US embassy in Honduras and making an application fair and square. All of us sitting here, we're all children, immigrants ourselves, or children of immigrants, or grandchildren of immigrants. In those days, you didn't go to a consulate in Moscow or in Kiev or in Budapest and make an application for the US. You got on a ship, you had a piece of paper in your hand saying you're healthy, and in you went. That's how it worked. So it's not like, you know, our forebears were such geniuses to go through the proper channels. There just weren't any channels to go through in those days. And now it's more and more difficult to get into the US, you know, because of the politics. That's just the way it is. Yeah. Okay, so now there's a reason not to accept immigrants because it would change the cultural and religious nature of the country. So in Canada, up until around 1965, you might know that we had a quota system in the country. And the quota system basically said if you weren't white, don't even bother applying to come into Canada, because we're only taking immigrants from Europe, and that was all. You know, Canada had this Chinese Exclusion Act. They had preferences only for Northern Europeans, and then they made it, okay, we'll take Southern Europeans. But up until that 1960s period, we had a strict, it was racial discrimination by another means, by another name, because they just said, we're taking immigrants from, you know, the UK and from Europe, and that's all. We're not taking immigrants from anywhere else. When this sort of civil rights movement came around in the 1960s, we abolished that system. And what we said is, we want qualified immigrants from anywhere in the world. And that's when, and only that's when, immigrants started to arrive from India, from China, and from Africa, and from the Middle East, and from everywhere else. Nowadays, that's where most of our immigrants come from. We don't get very many immigrants from Europe or from the US. All of the immigration we have is from the so-called third world, because that's where people want to get out of to improve their lives, etc. Now, you might say, and this is a big issue. It's a big issue. In Italy, it was a big issue as well, that we want the country to stay the way it is. That if we get too many immigrants from one place, I'm not even saying from one religion, it will change the nature of the country so that we won't recognize the country anymore, or that the values that these people bring to our country will overwhelm the values that we have already in this country. So that's the argument that's made. By and large, this argument is very false. By and large. The reason for that is, if you think of your own histories, people who come here, they want to integrate and assimilate as fast as possible. They want to make sure that their kids get in and get ahead. And if any of you have been around any schools, let's say, you know, the schools all around where I live, around Cote-saint-Luc area, there's Filipino kids and Vietnamese kids and Chinese kids. They all speak French to each other. They don't speak, you know, their own languages, because they want to assimilate and they want to be able to work. But, and here's the but, there's always a minority of people who are not like that. There's always a minority of people who will never change their outlooks themselves, or even worse, will try to convince people like them to radicalize and to threaten the country that they're in. And they don't think that the country is welcoming them. They think that they're there to do a job against the country. Now, it's true. There are people like this. We know of it, you know, from examples of, well, examples of, let's take some examples. Well, the Air India crash when you know, a Sikh person put a bomb on an Indian airline because he was still fighting, you know, disputes that were going on in India, that type of thing. You know, we can also mention, of course, all the Palestinian demonstrators here who are demonstrating, you know, and causing mayhem in the streets for an issue that has nothing to do with Canada. But if you look at the numbers, these numbers are tiny compared to the advantages that the country gets for receiving immigrants altogether. The idea of praying in the streets, and the idea, this whole idea, it reminds me of something. In Athens, Greece, Greece was once occupied by the Turkish Ottomans. For 300 years, the Turks ran Greece until it became independent in the 1800s. And of course, at that time, pretty well all the Muslims were kicked out of Greece when Greece became independent. There were mosques left over from the Turkish times. You could visit them today. They have big chains and locks on their fences, and that's the end of it. But you know, time never stands still. And Muslims began to arrive in Greece, just like they arrive everywhere else, from the Middle East, from you know, civil wars going on in Syria and Afghanistan and things that have nothing to do with Greece. And they end up in the city, and for better or for worse, they chose to make their homes there in Athens. Okay. Now, where are these people going to go pray? I mean, people, you know, who are religious want to pray. Athens says, we're not going to allow them to go back to the mosques because we chained them up and we don't want to establish a Muslim presence, an official Muslim presence in Athens. So what did the people do? They prayed on the street. Okay, because like, okay, what you know, what other choice are you giving us? So you could say, you see, I mean, let's put it like this. I mean, everything, go back to the beginning of what I said of context. I don't know about you people, but I remember distinctively the nuns walking down Côte St. Catherine Road in an enormous parade with their hats and with their crosses and with the bishop and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, where were all the people complaining about religion, public religion praying in the streets? Right? They weren't, because that's who they were. So to complain about people praying in the streets in Montreal today, which happens, it takes a little bit of hypocrisy to say something like that if it was tolerated. So you want to say, well, okay, we don't want Muslims to pray in the streets, but we want everybody else to have Simchas Torah marching around like in the way I you know, when I was a kid in Chamonix, they blocked off some streets for Simchas Torah and stuff like that. Nobody made a complaint of, hey, they're praying in the streets. So in essence, what you're doing is actually taking anti-Muslim prejudice and trying to develop it into some sort of a principle, which is, of course, hypocritical. And there's good reason for some of this feeling of anti-Muslim thing, because we of all people here have experienced plenty of problems with some of those communities, right? You know, there have been terrorist attacks in places all around the world. In France, for example, quite a large number. In Germany, they had them. In Belgium, they had them. Muslim radicals who go and attack innocent civilians in society. And so people's natural reaction is to say, well, we don't like them and we don't want them, and that's it. But the fact is that, say, Belgium is 10% Muslim. France is 10% Muslim. Now, how many terror acts are there? Not many. So you're condemning a whole bunch of people for the acts of a few people, which is, again, not rational. And you're forgetting about the contribution that these people are making in society, difficult as it may be for them to get along because of the prejudice that's in the country. The most successful countries in the world are the countries that integrate immigrants the best. And we are one of them. Australia is another one like that. There's other countries in the world who are similar in that way. So in other words, you have to see the context. It goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. You have to see the context of it. And integration is something that we understand takes a generation. If you look at it in those terms, you would say that whoever the last group of immigrants came in are the ones that people don't like. So let's go back into even our history or American history, the Irish people who came in the 1840s. Do you think they were welcome with open arms? No, people said, I don't want these Irish, they're drunks and they stink and they're dirty and they're thieves. We don't want them, okay? Until the next group of immigrants arrived. And then that was the same thing with them. Like when Ashkenazi Jews came into New York in the 1880s up to 1920, up to the First World War, these people, they were, you know, the skinflints, and they were bargainers, and they were running shops on the street, and they were dirty, and they were, you know, had too many children, and every complaint in the world you could read in the newspapers about that group of people. And then so it goes. So whatever the last group that comes in are the ones who get the blame because they're different from everybody else and they're new and they're starting off in a weakened position. But wait one or two generations and you see what happens to these people. You know that, for example, in Houston, the Nigerian community is one of the most well-off, successful business communities in the whole city. And they came as immigrants, and they established businesses, and they employ lots of people who aren't Nigerians. Look at all the Hispanic people who've come into, people who go to Florida and people who live in California know that, I know I hear music. Somewhere in the United States, there are somewhere around 80 million Hispanics. Now, some few of them lived in the United States before the United States became the United States. In other words, they're left over from Spanish rule of Greater Mexico. But the rest of them came in at some point or other. And if you look at them now, I mean, they're senators and congressmen and governors and, people who own businesses. And, that's what happens. People panic when they see somebody wearing a hijab. But that nowadays, it's like you don't even pay attention anymore. If you walk into Walmart, the cashier wears a hijab. If you walk into Costco, the cashier wears a hijab. If you go into a hospital, the nurses wear hijabs. I mean, after a while, you just get used to it because it's not threatening. In our minds, it became something that was threatening because of associations. But in actual fact, it's just an article of clothing. So that's what I'm saying, that, you have to be aware of let's say, of letting in people who are not suitable to come into the country, but to put a whole target or stain on a whole group of people because of the actions of a few people means that you don't have the context. You're not looking at both sides. That's just a message. That's all I'm saying. Now, in Quebec has a special, of course, role to protect the French language, right? You know that. So Quebec says we don't want so many immigrants because they're going to threaten French. If we're going to get immigrants, we only want them to speak French. In fact, what we would like as immigrants in Quebec is Quebecers who are outside of Quebec, who come to Quebec, and they're the best immigrants. Obviously, there are no Quebecers outside of Quebec who want to come to Quebec. So they have to take people from Algeria, from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Lebanon, from Egypt maybe, who are French, and from French West Africa, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Guinea, Burkina Faso. All these places are French speaking, and that's where our immigrants are coming from. So yes, the vast majority of them are Muslims who come from these places. So naturally, you're going to have a lot of Muslims come into Quebec, and naturally that's going to change the flavor of the way we operate here. How does it change the flavor? Well, go to Costco, my favorite store, and you will see a huge halal section. Huge. Go to the Metro store. Yeah, the Metro store. I go to Metro on Queen Mary. Like, the kosher section has kind of gotten smaller, and the halal section has kind of gotten bigger. It's not like bad. It just reflects the changes the society has. That's all it does. It's true that the important thing is to control the pace of it. That is also true. Let me give you the example of Haiti, the most miserable country in the Western Hemisphere. Do you know how many people live in Haiti? 11 million. Do you know how many people in Haiti are poor? 95%. Do you know how many people in Haiti would come here if they probably had the chance? Probably 10.99 million. So you can't have everybody showing up here all at the same time, because that would really change the nature of the place. But on the other hand, you know, every group of immigrants who's come here has made their mark in one way or another. And we're lucky. Before I go on to other things, I'll just say we're lucky that the vast majority of Canadians still have a positive view of immigration. But it could change. It could change because of, you know, politicians who are using the fear of immigration to stir the pot. You know, and Nigel Farage in Great Britain is a great example of that. Anyway, so migration, you know, there's an irony here. There's just an irony here, and I just want to check my time here. Yeah, there's an irony here. Maybe we'll finish with this. That in the United States, the economy, we said, is slowing down. But the unemployment rate in the US has just gone up a very little bit. So how come? Because the number of people that Trump kicks out every single day is matching the number of jobs that are being lost in the US every single day. So therefore, the economy is still going down, for sure. But the unemployment rate isn't shooting up because he's kicking out so many people who are working. So therefore, there hasn't been, you know what I mean, this huge spike in unemployment at this point. It's a kind of a bit of an irony. I also read a completely not related to any of this stuff. I read an interesting fact today that just was published, that in the whole wide world today, there are more children who suffer from obesity than who suffer from lack of food. Now, isn't that an amazing statistic? It's an amazing statistic. It tells you how the world has changed. Because, you know, you remember the ads from Save Our Children and all the ads of African stick thin children. Those are from the 50s and 60s. That's not the real Africa of today. So anyway, listen, yeah, I didn't realize I have like a whole page worth of stuff to tell you, but I'll have to wait till next time. So I'm going to take any comments, questions that you have. I'd be glad to stay here as long as you want. And thank you very much for listening. And thank you for showing up in such huge numbers. I'm so thrilled. Oh, yeah, okay. But you have to speak maybe. I'll repeat, because people listen. If you want to listen, please listen, because otherwise it becomes a jungle, you know? Oh, so how come the stock? It's a great question. It's a super great question. Why is the stock market doing so well in Canada and the US if the economy is turning down? So the stock market measures two different things. It measures how companies are doing today, and it measures what are people expecting the economy to do in the future, like maybe 6 months from now. Right now, companies are doing well. But the concentration of doing well is only in like the certain companies that do certain things. In the high-tech field, for example. The high-tech companies, the big seven, they call them, the magnificent seven, they take up so much space in the US economy that they're doing well and they affect the whole stock exchange average because they're so big. Then, of course, you have things like in Canada, our stock exchange is very strongly tilted towards gold mining, silver mining, oil industry. And if the demand for those raw materials is there, and often when an economy goes down, the demand for gold goes up. So our stock market is also holding up not too badly. But things can turn around pretty quickly. It just takes 1 or 2 quarters of bad results and things turn down. Like today, for example, all our insurance companies in the Canadian Stock Exchange took a dive. Great West Life, Power Corporation, and Sun Life, they went down a lot. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why. I didn't read why. But something must have spooked the investors to say, uh-oh, things are not looking good in the insurance business, you know? Uh, The American dollar is weakening against the world currencies. It isn't that compared to other currencies, it's on a downslide. It's on a downslide compared to, the euro and other world currencies. It hasn't been doing that well because of what people think is going to happen in the American economy. That's and that has its advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage of a weaker dollar is that inflation goes up because anything you buy from the outside costs more. So, I'm sorry? Oh, our dollar is weaker than theirs, but partly that is a reflection of our economy versus the American economy. I mean, the American average income per person in the US is about $62,000 a year. Comparatively, in Canada, it's only around $45,000 a year. So we're quite a bit behind them in wealth per person. Now, that doesn't mean that Canadians are poorer than Americans, because if all that wealth is concentrated on the top, then it means that the rest of the people in the US could be more poor than we are. You see, it's an average. It's not, it's not what everyone is making. But our government has kept our dollar weak on purpose because it wanted our economy to be competitive for exports. So that's been the policy of the Bank of Canada for quite a long time, to keep the dollar relatively low compared to the US dollar. And we don't have a big economy. So there's no big demand for Canadian dollars outside of Canada. It's not like in other places, Yes, over here, yeah. You want to know about my trip? Well, if you'd like, I could speak about Italy next time. If you want to know about Italy, it's an amazing country. Or China, sure. Sure. But yeah, China is, I spent 2 full weeks in China. And if President Trump thinks he could roll them over, boy, does he have something else coming. I mean, they're not gonna roll over to President Trump in any way. He can affect them for sure, but they can affect the US as well. So China is not going to just fold up stakes and say, yes, Mr. Trump, you're right, Mr. Trump. We'll do whatever you want, Mr. Trump. You can forget about that. Yeah, it's an amazing place. Just in electric cars, they're the world leaders in electric cars, and they sell more Chinese electric cars in Europe than Tesla or anybody else. They've taken over that whole market, so to speak. And I was in China in 2000, and I was in China in 2025. And the difference in those 25 years is just amazing. Maybe I'll speak about it next time. So thank you very much. We'll see you again.